What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I remember waking up that morning to the relentless spin of the ceiling fan in my cramped Cleveland apartment, its blades slicing through the heavy air as if attempting to carve away yet another layer of the quiet disappointment that had accumulated over the years. And as the reality of turning 30 settled in like an unwelcome guest who overstays their welcome, I realized with a sinking feeling that no birthday greetings had arrived, no cheerful messages from the family who were supposed to mark such occasions with at least a pretense of affection, leaving me instead with the solitary hum of the refrigerator and the faint rumble of traffic from the nearby highway that always underscored how trapped I felt in this suburban routine of coding marathons at a job that paid the bills but offered little in the way of fulfillment or recognition. Rolling over in the tangle of sheets that smelled faintly of last night's takeout, I reached for my phone out of sheer habit, hoping against hope for some overlooked notification that might salvage the day, but what greeted me instead was a vibrant Facebook post from my mother's page, filled with sun-drenched photos of the Eiffel Tower and my younger sister Lauren posing elegantly at a quaint Parisian cafe, her designer sunglasses perched just so and her smile radiating that effortless charm that had always seemed to eclipse my own more subdued existence, accompanied by a caption gushing about celebrating Lauren's recent promotion with the kind of lavish memories that money and favoritism could buy. And then, as if to drive the knife deeper into the wound of my invisibility, there was Mom's pointed comment threaded below, "She's the only one worth it." A phrase that echoed the unspoken hierarchy of our family dynamics stretching back to childhood, where Lauren's every whim was indulged as the sparkling gem of the household while I, Emily Harper, the dependable software developer who quietly managed the finances behind the scenes, was relegated to the role of the overlooked utility player whose contributions went unacknowledged and unrewarded. The words hit me with the force of a sudden storm, stirring a cocktail of raw anger, profound hurt, and that familiar exhaustion born from years of being the reliable one who wired emergency funds for Dad's unexpected car repairs or Lauren's half-baked entrepreneurial schemes without ever expecting a thank you beyond a cursory nod. And in that moment, lying there amid the disarray of my single life at 30, I felt a shift deep within, a spark of defiance igniting against the backdrop of their blatant neglect, because how many times had I swallowed the bitterness of being forgotten on holidays or passed over for family gatherings in favor of Lauren's latest adventure, all while propping up their lifestyle from the shadows of my modest savings. Instead of dissolving into tears or firing off an impulsive text laced with accusations, I pushed myself upright, my pulse racing with a mix of adrenaline and resolve that made the room feel smaller and more charged, and with a smile creeping across my face, not the forced polite one I usually wore in their presence, but a genuine, edged with steel expression that signaled the end of my passive endurance, I flipped open my laptop on the cluttered nightstand, the screen flickering to life like a portal to untapped power, and navigated swiftly to that long-dormant investment account, the one I had meticulously nurtured from a modest inheritance left by Grandma Harper into a substantial nest egg through careful stock picks and overtime-fueled contributions over the past decade. A financial fortress they had unknowingly relied upon without ever appreciating the architect behind it. My fingers hovered for only a heartbeat over the keyboard, weighing the gravity of what I was about to do against the years of accumulated slights that justified it, and then, with a decisive click that reverberated through the quiet space like the turning of a key in a long-locked door, I initiated the withdrawal, transferring a significant sum enough to more than cover the cost of their extravagant Paris getaway and the ongoing allowances I'd extended directly into my personal checking account, feeling an exhilarating rush of liberation course through me as the transaction processed, mingled with the undercurrent of unease because, after all, they were still family, bound by blood and shared history. Yet the sting of Mom's words propelled me forward, transforming guilt into a quiet validation of my right to reclaim what was mine. Closing the laptop with a soft snap that punctuated the moment like a period at the end of a long overdue sentence, I rose to brew a pot of coffee that filled the air with its robust aroma. savoring the first sip as if it were a toast to my newfound autonomy, and began idly browsing real estate listings in distant cities like Denver or Austin, places that promised a fresh start far from the gravitational pull of their expectations, allowing my mind to wander toward possibilities of independence that had always seemed just out of reach until now. But before I could lose myself in those daydreams, my phone vibrated insistently on the bed, displaying Mom's name and a voicemail preview that carried her familiar tone of indignation. "Emily, what on earth have you done? The money's vanished from the account, and Lauren's credit card was just declined at the hotel. We need this sorted immediately before everything falls apart." That voicemail from Mom lingered in the air like a bad aftertaste after a forced family dinner, her words laced with that urgent plea she reserved for financial crises, emphasizing how Lauren's Paris trip represented some irreplaceable boost to her career trajectory, while implying that my interference amounted to nothing short of sabotage against the family's fragile harmony. And as I listened to the full message with the phone pressed to my ear, a wave of incredulity washed over me because here she was, demanding explanations for a decision I'd made in the heat of justified resentment, as if the years of my uncelebrated support had evaporated into thin air the moment convenience turned inconvenient. I set the phone down carefully, my mind racing through the logistics of how quickly the withdrawal had rippled outward to disrupt their carefully curated vacation facade, and instead of dialing back immediately to appease her, I took a deep breath, allowing the initial surge of defensiveness to settle into a more calculated resolve that had been building since the moment I clicked that button, recognizing that this confrontation might finally force the truths I'd long suspected into the open. Truths about the uneven scales of affection and obligation that had defined our relationships for far too long in this typical American household, where appearances mattered more than equity. When I finally called her back, the line connected after just one ring, her voice bursting forth with a torrent of accusations about selfishness and ingratitude that painted me as the villain in a narrative she'd clearly rehearsed on the flight over. But I interrupted her midstream with a steady tone, laying out the facts I'd held back for years, detailing how I'd been the silent financier behind the scenes, covering everything from Dad's recurring truck maintenance bills that seemed to multiply with each fishing season to Lauren's string of aborted business ideas that drained resources like a leaky faucet, even the substantial down payment on their suburban home that they had accepted with barely a whisper of appreciation, all funneled through that investment account without fanfare or reciprocity. And as I spoke, I infused my words with a dry humor that masked the deeper hurt, joking about how Paris probably felt a tad less romantic when the croissants required actual payment rather than my invisible credit line. There was a stunned silence on her end, the kind that stretches taut like a wire about to snap, followed by her fumbling attempts to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming they had always assumed my contributions stemmed from some windfall at my tech job rather than deliberate sacrifice, which struck me as a complete fabrication, since I'd mentioned the account origins multiple times during those awkward holiday catch-ups, only to be met with glazed-over eyes and swift topic changes to Lauren's latest social media milestone. And in that exchange, the light vulgarity of the moment surfaced in my mind as I thought to myself what a load of baloney it all was, the way they rewrote history to suit their narrative of entitlement while I played the part of the dutiful daughter who never complained. The call devolved into a heated back and forth that dragged on for what seemed like an eternity, but clocked in at around half an hour, with me holding firm against her pleas to reverse the transfer by countering with pointed reminders of forgotten birthdays and overlooked achievements, quipping that maybe a dose of financial reality would make their next family toast a bit more genuine. And though she ended by sighing about how I was always so practical in that condescending way that equated reliability with dullness, I hung up feeling a tentative empowerment, the first real crack in the facade of their unquestioned dependence on me, prompting me to log back into the account interface where, with a mix of vindication and mild pettiness I justified as setting boundaries, I revoked access to the supplementary credit card I generously linked for Lauren's emergencies the previous year. watching the digital confirmation appear like a small but satisfying act of reclamation that would undoubtedly amplify the chaos unfolding across the Atlantic. As the adrenaline ebbed, leaving me with a hollow sort of satisfaction tinged by the ever-present undercurrent of familial guilt, my phone lit up again, this time with a text from Lauren herself. Not the expected barrage of anger, but a surprisingly candid admission that she had been the one fueling subtle rumors at extended family events about my supposed obsession with money as a way to deflect attention from her own mounting failures. A confession rooted in jealousy over the stability I'd quietly cultivated while she chased fleeting spotlights, and that revelation stung sharper than Mom's oversight because it came from the sister I'd shielded countless times from the consequences of her impulsiveness, yet it also ignited a fiercer determination to unearth the full extent of their deceptions, leading me to sift through archived emails and forgotten digital folders in search of documentation that might validate my suspicions. What emerged instead were those yellowed scans of letters from Grandma Harper's estate settlement, tucked away in an obscure subfolder I'd overlooked for years. Their faded ink hinting at provisions for the account as a protected asset earmarked specifically for the grandchild who demonstrated true stewardship rather than extravagance. Phrases that raised unsettling questions about whether the family had willfully ignored or even tampered with those intentions to favor Lauren's path, and as I pored over the details, my thoughts spiraled into a vortex of uncertainty about the deeper secrets buried in our shared past. Right at the moment when Dad's incoming call broke the silence, his gravelly voice cutting through with an uncharacteristic demand that I sort this mess out before it poisons the entire holiday season and drives us all apart for good. Dad's call came through like an unwelcome echo from the past, his voice roughened by years of factory shifts and unspoken regrets, carrying that familiar gruff insistence on family unity as if reciting lines from some outdated sitcom where everyone forgives and forgets over a backyard barbecue. And as he launched into his lecture about how pulling the financial rug out from under them threatened to unravel the holidays into a nightmare of resentment and division, I found myself leaning back against the kitchen counter, a wry smile tugging at my lips because the irony was almost comical, considering how he'd missed my high school plays for overtime and my college send-off for a weekend getaway with his poker buddies. Yet now he positioned himself as the moral compass demanding I restore the status quo to preserve some illusory peace. I let him vent for a stretch, interjecting only with measured questions about those estate letters I'd just rediscovered, probing gently at first about whether he recalled Grandma's stipulations for the account as a bulwark against recklessness rather than a free-for-all piggy bank, and as his responses grew evasive, mumbling about faded memories and legal fine print that no one paid much attention to back then, a deeper suspicion took root in my chest, the kind that transforms casual oversight into deliberate omission, prompting me to steer the conversation toward the broader financial entanglements that had kept me tethered to their needs for so long, casually mentioning how I'd started reviewing old statements and noticed patterns of debt accumulation that didn't add up without outside help. He deflected with grunts and sighs, insisting it was all water under the bridge and that dwelling on it would only breed more trouble, but his discomfort fueled my determination to dig deeper once we hung up, transforming the quiet of my apartment into a makeshift war room where I spread out printouts and laptop screens, piecing together the puzzle of how Lauren's ambitions had quietly ballooned into co-signed loans and credit extensions in Mom and Dad's names. Ventures like that ill-fated boutique she swore would revolutionize online fashion, but instead left a trail of maxed-out lines and collection notices that they'd shielded from me by dipping into my contributions without full disclosure. A betrayal that layered fresh hurt atop the birthday snub and made the air feel thicker with the weight of their collective deceptions. The anger simmered not as a blaze, but as a persistent undercurrent, driving me to craft a subtle counterstroke that felt both ingenious and laced with the petty satisfaction of payback, so I composed an email to Aunt Karen, the quintessential family connector who thrived on whispers at reunions and church socials, framing the attached redacted debt summaries as a heartfelt warning from an anonymous, concerned relative about potential risks to the extended clan's gatherings if finances spiraled. Further, knowing full well her tendency to circulate such tidbits would corner Lauren in the court of familial opinion without implicating me directly, and as I hit send, a quiet chuckle escaped me at the thought of the fallout. Imagining the awkward silences at Thanksgiving tables where Lauren's charm offensive would clash against the undercurrent of scrutiny, a witty inversion of how she'd always stolen the spotlight while I faded into the wallpaper. Yet even as that small victory settled in, the toll of the confrontation manifested physically, my temples beginning to throb with the onset of another migraine that had plagued me intermittently over the past months. The kind physicians attributed to chronic stress, but which I recognized as the somatic echo of shouldering invisible loads, forcing me to dim the lights and swallow a handful of pills while questioning in the haze whether my pursuit of justice was empowering me or merely excavating a void that left me more isolated. The dilemma sharpening as I pondered if audiences to my story might side-eye my choices as stubbornly vengeful rather than rightfully assertive, especially when the very act of reclaiming my agency amplified the physical reminders of the cost. Staring at the ceiling through half-lidded eyes, I tried to push aside the doubt that whispered I was morphing into the antagonist they accused me of being, the hoarder disrupting the flow rather than the steward demanding fairness. Particularly as a text from Mom arrived with a photo of Lauren's downcast face against a bland Parisian backdrop, her plea wrapped in guilt-tripping language about mending fences before irreparable damage set in. But before I could muster a reply that balanced candor with caution, my phone rang again, this time with the voice of a paralegal from the family lawyer's office, her tone clipped and professional as she relayed Mom's recent inquiry into contesting the account's ownership on grounds of undue influence from the estate terms, hinting at an impending legal skirmish that could drag this personal reckoning into the unforgiving arena of courtrooms and depositions. The paralegal's call wrapped around me like a noose tightening with each detail she outlined, explaining how Mom had quietly initiated a preliminary claim on the account by citing vague clauses in Grandma's will about familial support obligations, an attempt to reclassify my inheritance as a shared resource rather than the protected individual asset it had always been intended as, and as I absorbed the implications during that tense conversation, a surge of disbelief mingled with amusement bubbled up because the audacity of it all struck me as almost farcical. This woman who had dismissed my 30th birthday with a snide social media barb now mobilizing legal machinery to claw back what she'd never valued in the first place, all while framing it as a matter of equity in a family where equity had long been a one-way street flowing toward Lauren's whims. I thanked the paralegal for the heads-up, promising to consult my own advisor promptly, and once the line went dead, I paced the length of my living room, the migraine from earlier dulling into a persistent ache that mirrored the tangled web of loyalties and betrayals unspooling in my mind, forcing me to confront how deeply ingrained their manipulations ran. From the subtle nudges during holidays to encourage generosity, to the outright deceptions that had siphoned my hard-earned security without remorse, and in that reflective haze, I recognized the opportunity for a countermove that blended strategy with the sharp what I'd honed from years of navigating their dismissals, so I reached out to the family accountant, a no-nonsense professional who'd handled Dad's taxes for decades and owed me a favor from when I'd tipped him off to a deduction oversight, drafting an email that clarified the account's ironclad sole ownership under the estate's explicit terms, attaching notarized copies of the letters and will excerpts that underscored Grandma's intent to safeguard it for the grandchild who built rather than borrowed, and by carbon copying Mom, Dad, and even Lauren, I ensured the message landed like a precision strike, illuminating the fragility of their claims without descending into outright confrontation. Watching the delivery notifications ping in sequence, as if marking the unraveling of their carefully constructed illusions. The satisfaction of that dispatch carried a humorous edge in my thoughts, picturing Mom's face flushing with the realization that her ploy had backfired into a spotlight on their fiscal follies. A light vulgarity coloring my internal monologue as I mused what a bunch of hogwash their sense of entitlement truly was. Yet beneath the triumph lurked the growing uncertainty of where this left us, my family bonds fraying like an old sweater pulled too tight, prompting me to log into the account once more and redirect a healthy portion of the remaining balance into a personal trust fund geared toward my own horizons, perhaps funding a relocation to a vibrant city like Portland, where tech opportunities abounded without the shadow of Midwestern obligations. A proactive step that felt like weaving safety nets from the threads of their neglect while simultaneously questioning if such self-preservation veered too close to selfishness in the eyes of those who might judge from afar. Especially as the dilemmas compounded with Lauren's escalating texts that shifted from defensiveness to raw vulnerability, confessing not just knowledge of Mom's failed access attempt, but active encouragement of it during a low point in her life, a revelation that twisted the sibling rivalry into something more poignant, forcing me to weigh the pain of her complicity against the echoes of our shared childhood, where I'd often covered for her scrapes to shield her from Dad's temper. The conflict intensified as I sifted through more documents unearthed from the estate files, uncovering the twist that the account's seed money traced back to a forgotten portion of Grandma's assets, specifically earmarked for my mother's side of the family, a bequest that had been quietly redirected years ago under Dad's influence to offset his undisclosed gambling losses, meaning my stewardship had inadvertently propped up not just their lifestyle, but a legacy of fiscal irresponsibility that now circled back to haunt me, deepening the emotional rift as I pondered Dad's vague apologetic email that arrived mid-afternoon, its words skirting accountability with platitudes about time healing wounds while conveniently omitting his role in the diversions, leaving me adrift in a sea of ambiguity about whether loyalty demanded reconciliation or if true freedom lay in severing the ties that had defined me for so long. The impending revenge feeling both inevitable and fraught with the risk of permanent isolation that might make observers to my tale root against my unyielding stance even as they understood its origins. As evening shadows lengthened across the room, casting long silhouettes that mirrored the elongated uncertainties in my heart, the doorbell chimed unexpectedly, pulling me from my reverie, and when I peered through the peephole, there stood Lauren on the threshold, her face streaked with the remnants of travel-worn makeup and exhaustion, a battered suitcase at her feet as she lifted pleading eyes toward the door, her voice muffled but insistent through the wood as she begged to come in and lay bare the full story of why our family had always cast me as the outsider in their narrative of worth. Lauren's unexpected arrival at my doorstep transformed the quiet evening into a whirlwind of unresolved tensions, her disheveled appearance and the weight of her suitcase speaking volumes about the abrupt end to her Parisian escape. And as I hesitated with the door half open, weighing the risks of inviting in the very source of so much heartache against the pull of blood ties that had always complicated my judgments, she launched into a plea laced with sincerity that pierced through my guarded resolve, promising explanations that might finally illuminate the shadows of our family's favoritism without the usual deflections or blame-shifting, so I stepped aside, gesturing her into the living room where the remnants of my solitary dinner still cluttered the coffee table, and we settled onto the couch with an awkwardness that hung between us like the fog rolling off Lake Erie on a damp morning. Her eyes red-rimmed from what I assumed was a mix of jet lag and genuine remorse as she began unraveling the tangled history we'd both inherited but experienced so differently. Over slices of cold pizza that served as an impromptu peace offering, she confessed the full extent of the favoritism's roots, revealing how Mom's preference for her stemmed from a buried guilt over Dad's long-ago affair that had nearly shattered their marriage when I was just a toddler, an indiscretion that produced Lauren as the fresh start child meant to mend the fractures. A secret they'd shrouded in silence while channeling all their emotional investments into her as a way to rewrite their narrative of failure, and as she spoke, the pieces clicked into place with a clarity that both validated my resentments and stirred an unwelcome empathy. Because hearing how Dad had not only known about the skewed affections, but actively enabled them by diverting portions of Grandma's inheritance to cover his gambling debts that my account had unknowingly subsidized for years, transformed the betrayal from a series of slights into a systemic deception that had shaped my life in ways I hadn't fully grasped, leaving me to stare at her in a stunned silence broken only by the distant hum of neighborhood traffic that underscored the isolation of this revelation. The humor crept in despite the gravity, a wry observation crossing my mind about how our family gatherings resembled bad reruns of those old soap operas where everyone schemed behind velvet curtains. And I quipped aloud that Paris must have lost its allure when the real drama waited back home in the form of overdue truths, a light vulgarity threading through my tone as I dismissed their collective hogwash about unity as nothing more than a convenient cover for self-serving choices. Yet beneath the banter, the dilemma gnawed at me fiercely, forcing a confrontation with whether my escalating revenges, from the initial withdrawal to the legal clarifications and fun diversions, had liberated me or merely erected walls that mirrored the ones they'd built around their secrets, especially as Lauren admitted her complicity in staying silent about Dad's manipulations out of fear that exposing them would dismantle the fragile pedestal she'd been placed upon. A confession that made me question if audiences to this saga might view my unyielding pursuit of payback as a tragic overreach, the kind that empowers on the surface but erodes the soul underneath, particularly when the migraines that had shadowed my days intensified into a pounding reminder of the stress I'd invited by refusing to let go sooner. As the night deepened and our conversation meandered through memories of childhood vacations where I'd been the tag-along rather than the star, I shared fragments of my own burdens. The quiet health scares I'd downplayed, like the persistent fatigue that doctors linked to burnout, but which I knew stemmed from the emotional labor of being the invisible pillar, and in that vulnerability, I finalized the last withdrawal from the account that morning, transferring the entirety into a new portfolio under my sole control, earmarked for therapies, travels, or perhaps a complete reinvention in a sunlit state far from Cleveland's gray skies. Feeling the digital shift as a culmination of defiance that brought a sharp-edged satisfaction, mingled with the hollow echo of what might have been if they'd seen my worth beyond the wallet. We parted ways ambiguously in the pre-dawn hours, Lauren curling up on the guest bed with no promises extracted from me, and as I lay awake listening to the rain patter against the window, the uncertainty swelled into a profound reflection on the cost of vengeance, wondering if reconnecting on altered terms could salvage fragments of the family I'd once craved, or if the smarter path lay in embracing solitude as the price of authenticity, leaving the future suspended in a thought-provoking limbo, where the lines between victim and victor blurred, and the true measure of healing remained as elusive as the Paris lights they'd chased at my expense.